Kitchin, Professor of Human Geography in Maynooth, a former colleague of mine when I was soldiering in Maynooth some years ago. But Rob has been director of the National NIRSA, which is the National Institute of Regional and Spatial Analysis, and that kind of sums up his interest. His interest is spatial analysis, spatial planning. I suppose to introduce him and what he's going to say to you tonight, data and big data is a term that you may not be familiar with, but it's basically, as far as I can see, I'm not an expert in this, but as far as I can see, it's about all the information and data and information that is being collected about people and about the population, and how that can now be accessed and modeled and mapped and put into computers and produced in various ways. And a lot of the images that you're going to see tonight and graphs and maps and so on from Rob are reflections of his interest in managing and manipulating and modelling data. He's Professor of Human Geography. He's been teaching for 20 years in Maynooth. He's published many books, dozens of books I should say, or dozens of articles, 30 or 40 books. He's also, in his spare time, between all the other work that he does in research and so on, as for example at the moment he's the head investigator for a big European Research Council project funded by the European Research Council, which has employed 16 to 20 people conducting research in the areas that Rob is interested in. But in the meantime, between all of these things, he also writes books, he writes fiction, he writes crime novels and so on. I think he does it between 7 and 10 o'clock every evening. At other times then he does his serious work. So anyway, to talk to us tonight about planning and the National Planning Framework and why planning keeps failing in Ireland, Professor Rob Kitchin.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paddy, and thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I'm going to talk about planning. Now, I haven't actually worked on this for a couple of years. I have to kind of get myself back up to speed on this. I've been busy with this European project. And I'm going to kind of fly through this quite quickly, and pretty much my script is on the screen. So the way that I kind of work is, so some of the slides will be quite text heavy, but everything on the slides I'll say, and everything I say should be on the slides, and that basically covers anybody who's kind of partially deaf or partially sighted or whatever. They should hopefully be able to follow along. So don't get worried if it's too text heavy in places. So this is a good example of a text-heavy slide. So this is just taken from the National Spatial Strategy, and this is where I want to start. I'm going to do a kind of a brief history, so I'm just going to get my notes that I want to get. So there was as you'll be aware, there was a kind of a National Spatial Strategy which launched in 2002. I'm going to start from this point to kind of work back and then work forwards. And I started at this point because we now have a new national planning framework which kind of replaces this piece of policy. And at the time the National Spatial Strategy was launched, it was launched as a 20-year strategy, in the same way the National Planning Framework is now a 22-year strategy. It was designed to enable every place in the country to reach its potential, no matter what its size or location, and it sought to organise and coordinate these roles in a complementary, win-win way. In order to achieve more balanced regional development, a greater share of economic activity was meant to take place outside of the Greater Dublin area, and it was meant to enable all sectors of the economy to plan future investment in a better informed way. And one of the conditions was the government will ensure that its own policies are implemented in a manner consistent with the National Spatial Strategy. And what the strategy did was it divided up the country into 5 zones, and it identified 18 gateways and hubs. I don't know if you can kind of see the colours, but they kind of radiate in these kind of bands across. So there was a kind of consolidating area, which is Greater Dublin. There was what they called a strengthening area, which was the south, southeast, west, north, west, to complement Dublin. A revitalising of the west and southwest, a reinforcing of central parts of Ireland, southeast, and cooperating in an all-Ireland context. And then there was this kind of hodgepodge of gateways and hubs. So we had kind of Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, Waterford, Dundalk, Sligo, Letterkenny, Derry, Athmore, Tullamore, Mullingar as this kind of linked gateway. And then the hubs were Cavan, Ennis, Kilkenny, Mallow, Monaghan, Wexford, Ballina, Castlebar, Tralee, Killarney. So these were all designated as effectively as growth poles where investment was going to go into. So just to kind of look at this kind of history of planning leading up into this National Spatial Strategy, and then what happened with the National Spatial Strategy, which kind of goes to my title, which is around kind of the failure of planning. As most of you will be aware, the National Spatial Strategy failed as a piece of policy. So planning in Ireland is actually relatively young. It's about 55 years old. First piece of planning legislation was in 1963, which was the Local Government Planning and Development Act, which actually came into force in 1964. It introduced local development plans and planning commissions, and it created 87 planning authorities. And there was no higher level of oversight over those planning authorities, so they effectively had their own autonomy. As you can imagine, 87 planning authorities for a country the size of Ireland is actually quite a lot. In 1986, then we had an Urban Renewal Act, and it introduced tax incentive-led development in urban areas. So this kind of led on into places like Custom House, Docks Development Agency, and so on. And then in 1994 we had 8 regional authorities established through the Local Government Act. And that's established 8 regional authorities, and they would evolve to eventually get a regional planning function. 1997 we had a Sustainable Development Act, a strategy for Ireland, including policies on spatial planning, urban development and regeneration. November 1997 we had the initiation of a National Development Plan. So this was meant to coordinate infrastructure spend and planning on a sectoral basis, so kind of health, transport, economy and so on. And then in March 1998 we had a Finance Act, and part of what the Finance Act did was it enabled the Rural Renewal Scheme for the Upper Shannon region, and basically gave tax incentive development for the 5 counties of Sligo, Longford, Leitrim, Cavan and Roscommon. And then in March, then in 1999 we have the European Spatial Planning Development Perspective, and we also have the Greater Dublin Area Strategic Planning Guidelines. And the EDSP is important because it advocated for a strategic spatial planning process, i.e. we should try to coordinate the planning of infrastructure and housing and jobs and development on a coordinated spatial basis across the whole country. Okay, so not leaving it at a local level, but actually to have a wider framework. And Ireland was one of the first countries then to implement this in a policy form through the National Spatial Strategy. So this kind of gave an impetus in. But we've also got these other processes kind of happening with planning coming onto a formalised basis and then setting up the regional authorities and so on. Then in November of 1999 we had the National Development Plan published, which ran from 2000 to 2006. And it set up the basis. It published 5 operational programmes, 2 regional programmes, plus a peace process programme, and it called for balanced regional development and identified 5 gateway cities. And the 5 gateway cities were Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick and Waterford, which are now the 5 of the gateway cities in the new national planning framework. Okay, so we kind of had this started a process of identifying where we thought growth regional poles should be, and we identified the 5 principal cities that should act as that economic engine driving the economy, and where jobs and population should the predominance of the growth should be located. In 2000 we had a Planning and Development Act, and set up the basis for hierarchical spatial planning, so local and county development plans having due regard for forthcoming regional planning guidelines. Then in 2001 we had Regional Development Strategy for Northern Ireland, and then we moved into a second phase which was the kind of the rollout and then the foundering of the National Spatial Strategy. Now, hopefully, what you can see is there's actually a dual thing running backwards and forwards on these, and you can see as I've got them marked out here, we're basically going Department of Environment, Department of Finance, Department of Environment, Department of Environment, Department of Finance, Department of Environment, Department of Finance, Department of, there's a kind of a ping pong going backwards and forwards between these two government departments who are putting in place strategies designed to drive kind of local, regional economies and also drive how development should happen. And they're not in sync, and they're often partially contradictory and don't often have regard for each other. And then this kind of happens again in this process of setting up the National Spatial Strategy. So the Spatial Strategy was launched in 2002, and there was a kind of a Planning and Development Amendment Act which exempted zoning and local area plans from ministerial oversight. So you kind of have this plan, and then you immediately step back from government in relation to oversight, partly in relation to that plan. And then almost straight away you have a kind of decentralisation programme coming from the Department of Finance, particularly coming from Charlie McCreevy, which put in place the idea to move 48 government departments and state agencies, over 10,000 public servants, to 58 locations in 25 local authorities, almost all of which were not in the gateways and hubs which have been identified in the National Spatial Strategy as the preferred locations for development. So you have two policies coming very quickly on the back of each other, one of which cut the legs away from the other one. So if you go back to the first slide where it said government departments must have due regard to the National Spatial Strategy, and immediately the Department of Finance has no due regard to the National Spatial Strategy and puts in place a completely different policy around kind of spatial planning and development. And then mid-2004 we have the regional planning guidelines coming in place, providing this kind of mid-level between the National Spatial Strategy and local authority development plans, providing some guidance around that. 2006 we have the National Development Plan, and this was a time where the two start to sync together. So the National Spatial Strategy and National Development Plan were always meant to sync with each other. You saw the National Development Plan was launched 2 years before the National Spatial Strategy, which basically meant that the NSS missed its funding cycle. So for the first 4 years, the NSS really had no funding. There was an attempt then to link the two together in the mid-2000s. So the NDP became a kind of a sectoral and spatial plan as opposed to just a sectoral plan, and was meant to be the funding programme for running forward the NSS. And it was to fund things like, so the first, one of their programmes was going to be a kind of a gateway initiative fund where gateway cities could apply for funding to put in kind of infrastructure investment to help grow those towns and cities. By 2008, Ireland enters the crisis, and the Gateways Initiative Fund is actually the very first piece of funding cut from government. And so that part disappeared, and pretty much at that point, with the financial crisis in full swing, money cycled out of all of the kind of capital spend, infrastructure spend, spend around this kind of development-led initiatives. And then by 2010 we enter a Planning and Development Amendment Bill, which includes a new core strategy, which tries to move things away from having due regard. So local authorities didn't have to do what was in the NSS; they just had to have due regard to it or a nod towards it, as opposed to following it directly. So this was meant to align that up so people couldn't deviate away off. And then in 2010, there's an update of the NSS and a kind of an outlook, and it kind of reaffirms the approach of the NSS that at this point is effectively dead as a piece of policy. And then we kind of come into the last phase, which is its disintegration, which is the National Development Plan is terminated. It's succeeded by a new National Recovery Plan under DEPA, so back into the Department of Finance again. In November 2011, we have an Infrastructure and Capital Investment Plan running for 2012 to 2016. In February 2013, the NSS is officially scrapped by the Minister, who basically says there will be a new policy in due course, which is not yet named. December 2013, we have a midterm economic strategy, which is to run from 2014 to 2020. May 2014, we have Construction 2020 being published. A lot around kind of local development, housing, provision, and so on. May 2014 as well, we have Local Government Act, Regional Authorities Amendment Order. And this abolishes the 8 regional authorities to be replaced with 3 regional assemblies. So this is a new piece of governance infrastructure that you'll see becomes important in terms of the new national planning. And one of their chief responsibilities is to prepare regional, spatial and economic strategies. 2014 Government Reform Act, and it abolishes town and council boroughs, and it merges 3 of the city and county councils. And the effect of that is to radically reduce the number of planning authorities. The number of planning authorities dropped from 88 down into the mid-30s. So it's quite a big shift there. January to 2015, again a new Planning Act, new planning policy statement, and it basically announces there's going to be a new national planning framework. And 2015 is another economic development strategy, which is the framework for development of regional enterprise strategies, which interestingly enough doesn't mention the regional assemblies. So again, you've got this kind of Department of Finance, Department of Environment, pinging backwards and forwards on kind of regional planning, regional economics, spatial planning, local development, and so on. And what it kind of means is that we've never really had effective spatial planning in Ireland. We've had a kind of a hodgepodge of different policies coming out at different times through different government administrations, prioritising some places over other places and prioritising some initiatives over others. But we've never really had a strong coordinated planning system. So that's what my kind of title around planning kind of failing. But there's also kind of another issue around planning failing. So I'll just talk about the National Spatial Strategy first, and then I'll talk about other issues around planning failing. So why did the NSS fail? Well, I've probably given you a number of issues already. The first was it tried to be all things to all people. This kind of win-win situation, everybody wins. Everywhere was meant to grow and everywhere to have resources, but at the same time it still picked winners in the terms of the gateways and hubs. And we know that what went into the cabinet meeting and what came out of the cabinet meeting were 2 different things. So there was a political game that went on to get different places onto that, onto being a hub or a gateway. There were probably too many of these gateways and hubs. They were spread too thinly to provide a counterweight to Dublin, and there was an issue of critical mass. And some of them were very small. Some of them are just populations of 10,000 people. In a global economic context, 10,000 people is a village. It's not a global engine of growth. It's too small to take large FDI, and it should be pursuing probably a different type of economic strategy to somewhere like Dublin. Dublin is not competing with Cork or Galway. Dublin is competing with Barcelona and Brussels and Berlin and other cities of scale in Europe. They're operating in a different type of environment. And places like Tralee, with a population of probably 10,000 people, is not really competing with Dublin, and it's not really competing with mid-sized cities elsewhere in Europe either. It's a village that has a regional place within the Irish economy, but in terms of foreign direct investment, it's a very small place. Okay. And so that making it a hub and saying it's going to be an engine of growth for the Irish economy is problematic in that sense. That's not to say it doesn't provide a very important role in the Irish economy and shouldn't provide an important role in the Irish economy. It's just what kind of role is it meant to function as. As I already said, there was political interference in the selection of the gateways and hubs. The link concept on polycentric development really happens around large cities. It doesn't happen in relation to small towns. The Atlow, Mullingar, Tullamore, if you looked at the interaction between those places, it's like less than 4% of people live in one and work in the other. So there's very little interaction. They're quite far away from each other. They're really their own small economies. They're not a single linked economic function in the terms of polycentric development. Had some regard to the regional development strategy in Northern Ireland, but not fully aligned. And if you place the regional development strategy map and the Irish National Spatial Strategy map, there were arrows going into the north and arrows going into the south, but they didn't go in and out in the same places. And it wasn't linked to job creation, and IDA and Enterprise Ireland were left to drive the location of new employment locations completely free of the NSS. There was obviously the temporal misalignment, so it missed its funding cycle. It missed the 2000 to 2006 NDP. It was underpinned by the NDP for 2007 to 2013, but then the crisis hit and that fund just disappeared and was very quickly terminated. And it was willfully undermined by and not supported by government, and a lack of cross-departmental alignment, which I'm going to talk about later on. But basically, government departments and state agencies weren't aligning themselves up with the NSS themselves. There was a lack of statutory footing for hierarchical planning. So the NSS wasn't on a statutory basis. Decentralisation programme and policies such as the Upper Shannon Renewal Scheme cut across and ignored the NSS. There was actually very little support in general from the public as well as political and so on. And basically the DOF and the Department of Environment were pursuing their own agendas. Sometimes they had due regard to each other. But it's quite clear that economists and planners don't necessarily share the same view. And when the crisis hit, economists reverted to type, which is kind of macro or sectoral, and spatial planning went out the window. So rather than try and coordinate things on a spatial basis, it was revert back to planning on the basis of communications or transport or education or health or whatever within these kind of vertical silos. Okay, so that's kind of why the NSS kind of failed. We could probably make a case that there was also a wider planning failure. So from the crisis until the present, there's a real question as to what role did planning have in that crisis. In the sense that the planning frameworks form the basis for the framework for around property development. And we all know that property development was a key element of the financial crisis in Ireland. And we had a planning regime that was market-led, it was laissez-faire, and it was pro-development. And I'm going to illustrate that through talking about the crisis. But I'm going to argue that the crisis is longer than just 2008 to pretty much the present. I'm going to argue that the crisis really started around 1996. Now we did need a lot of new housing, and we did need a lot of development. The population of Ireland increased by 1 million people between 1991 and 2011. It grew by 30%. We also had household fragmentation, so the number of people per house was shrinking, so we needed more houses for those two reasons. We also needed, so that was a pressure, so the crisis is we need to produce a lot of property and we need to produce it quite quickly. Okay? We need to diversify the housing stock. So a lot of housing in Ireland was for three or four bed. You need to start moving towards apartments, 2 beds, different types of housing for different types of people, and so on. We had a whole chunk of housing stock that was coming to the end of its life. A lot of social housing schemes, so the big regeneration schemes in Ballymon and Limerick and other places. We had a lot of zoned land, but a lot of that land was being sat on by developers who were letting it appreciate in price rather than coming into the development cycle. And it meant by the time we got to the crisis, we had a huge amount of zone land. So in 2008, there were 40,000 hectares of zone land for a potential of 460,000 people. There's no shortage of zone land. We had loads of it. And during the crisis, we de-zoned a lot of this. We also had an additional 30,000 hectares of unserviced zone land. And in the new national planning framework, the department actually says we had enough land zoned in 2008 for a population of 10 million people, at the time where we had a population of 4.5 million people. Okay? But a lot of that land wasn't necessarily actually coming into development, it was being sat on. And we had explosive growth in house prices. So house prices grew by 350 to 500% during this period, depending on where you were in the country. But in quarter three in 1995, the average second-hand house price was 4.1 times the average industrial wage. By quarter two 2007, it was 11.9 times. This is what this graph is. This is wages. This is average new homes, second homes. Okay, so huge growth in house prices, putting houses beyond the reach of people earning lower salaries. And in fact, at this point, we're having kind of 75% of mortgages being dual income households. You basically have to have two incomes in your household to get a mortgage. Okay, so to me, that's a crisis. It's a crisis of unaffordability in terms of what's happening with the market. This is what happened with land prices. So land shot up in value in kind of 2005, 2006. If you want to get a sense of this, is Ireland down here. Land was twice the cost of any other European country, and you can see how that kind of went. So land was shot up in value as the property boom kind of reached its crescendo. Crisis 2 is where the crisis kind of tips over, and we end up with an oversupply of housing. We end up with unfinished estates. We have stored regeneration, collapsed PPP schemes. We have plunging prices. We have negative equity in mortgage arrears. We have quality issues with the boom era stock. We have long social housing list, rental supply, supplement bill. We have large amounts of vacancy in commercial property. About 20% of offices in Dublin were vacant. I think at the height it was about 23% of offices in Dublin were vacant in 2010, 2011. With very extensive retail vacancy. We actually doubled the amount of retail space in the country in a kind of a 5-year period between 2005 2008 and 2009. So that stock was coming onto the market at the point where the market was starting to tail off. And so this is what kind of happened. So this is between 1991 and 2011, households grew by 625,000. The number of housing units increased by 834,000. So that's the oversupply, basically. We needed a lot of housing, but we still built too many, basically. Okay. So this is what we were doing as a rate of number of units per 1,000 people. Ireland and Spain, Spain also has a big crisis around ghost estates and vacant property. We were building kind of twice the rate per 1,000 people as anywhere else. This is house completions. You can see we're kind of rapidly growing up. 93,000 houses being built in 2006. We have the crisis, and it plunges right back down again. This is what happens to the Upper Channel renewal scheme. So this is this area here. Basically, there was tax breaks in that area for any property. It didn't have to be linked into a town. So it wasn't like other Section 23, which were linked into particular towns. This was any property anywhere in that area. One-off housing, everything got a tax break. Okay, and this is what happened with housing here. So you can see they're running along at kind of 300 or 400 properties a year. Tax scheme, rural renewal scheme is introduced here, 98, and it shoots up. So Cavan is building kind of 2,600, 2,700 houses in 2005, 2006, and it probably only built, it's like 5-6 years worth of, it's building probably 200 or 300. It's kind of 10 years of development in a single year. Okay. Between 2002 and 2009, the stock of that area increased by 50%. So huge proportion of housing in those areas built in that 7-8 year period. population and households did not grow anywhere near that rate. There wasn't a 50% increase in households in those 7 years in those counties. And it led to this issue around housing vacancy. So this is the housing vacancy from the census. This is housing vacancy. Now this includes holiday homes in this map here, but anywhere in the dark red is over 25%. If we take out, so this is taking out the holiday homes, and you can see even with that, Leitrim is up over 20%, Longford, Roscommon, County, Cavan, Sligo. So those 5 are all in that Upper Shannon renewal scheme. Mayo is number 4 on this list, up over 15% vacancy, excluding the holiday homes. That doesn't include the holiday homes. So we kind of had 289,000 units at that time being classified as vacant, about 60,000 of them holiday homes. It's an oversupply rate of about 110,000. So the oversupply is basically you take out the holiday homes and you take out a base vacancy. So some property is always going to be vacant. It's between rentals, it's between lets. If somebody's in a nursing home, somebody's away on work, whatever it might be. We basically had an oversupply in the country of about 110,000 units. And then we had this phenomenon called unfinished estates, the ghost estates, where basically these were estates being developed at the point of the crisis, and development stopped on them basically. So this is the Department of Environment map at the time that showed the location of all of these estates all over the country, everywhere. In the middle of Dublin, whole tower blocks empty, apartment complexes empty, and then these, if you wanted to see any of them, you just go and looked at. If you went and looked on Google Earth, you could literally see them. And then obviously there was huge issues around these estates and how to deal with them, and what to do to resolve that issue. And there's still, I think, around 420 estates classified under this. A lot of them have been resolved through various schemes, but there's about 420 that still have development issues still on them. But a whole series of issues around build quality, which is which is a part of an issue around planning in relation to inspections and making sure buildings comply with building control and planning and so on. So a classic example of this with Priory Hall, which probably most of you heard about. People are out of their homes for 24 months, although they start to pay their mortgages on them. 187 departments unsafe to live in. It's estimated about 20,000 homes have pyrite in. The department at the time claimed there were 74 estates with about 12,000 houses, but still there's still a large number of stock that's got serious problems around pyrite and structural issues as a result of that. And then we know what happened with property prices. So property prices plunged. At the bottom of the thing was around 50%. For departments, it was 60%. And so property prices depressed everywhere. And that led into mortgage arrears and negative equity. And so people were losing their jobs, and the unemployment rate went up. We've got mortgages, how do you break the difference, and so on. And by Q4 of 2012, 18% of mortgages were more than 90 days in arrears. 11% were more than 90 days in arrears, 18% in arrears. 19% of buy-to-let accounts were in more than 90 days arrears. So there's a large body of distressed amateur landlords, and there's negative equity. About almost 50% of households are in negative equity at this point. Okay, so they basically paid more money than the house is worth, which creates problems of moving. So people can't, basically they're locked in place, they can't sell and move to somewhere else, and so on. So that has labour force consequences. People can't afford a mortgage and afford rent somewhere else, and so on. Then social housing, we have kind of issues around people not being able to afford the private sector, and so they need social housing. In 1961, about 18% of all households were in social housing. By 2011, that shrunk to 8%. The number of households in need of social housing, though, grew quite rapidly between 2005 and 2011, so from 43,000 to 98,000, dropped slightly by 2013. huge number of households receiving rent supplements, so about 97,000 households receiving rent supplement in late 2010, which basically means they're in private rental accommodation, but their rent is being subsidised by the state. And at that time, the number of homeless households had risen from around 1,400 to 2,300. Okay, so at that time, that's seen as quite a significant problem. As I'll say later on, this now seems kind of trivial. In January of this year, over 9,000 people accessed homeless emergency services in the country. So homelessness has radically increased since this time. We also know that social housing is at the end of its life in some cases and needs to be regenerated. And the strategy for this was to use public-private partnerships. So a lot of this property was had social problems, but it also had infrastructure problems and management problems and so on. And these projects all collapsed kind of 2008, and it left a whole series of people who'd moved out of these properties for these to be regenerated to move back out, and it left some families who hadn't yet moved out locked into these developments that were now half empty. I took out the slide that showed you the numbers per estate, but there's a significant number of people marooned in them and a significant number of people marooned out of them. Okay, and then we can kind of argue maybe there's a third phase of this, which is from kind of 2013 onwards, where we kind of have a dual market start to exist between Dublin and the rest of the country in terms of what's going on with house prices, what's going on with rent prices, although that's started to shift around now. Dublin is now starting to experience issues of supply, issues of growing demand, issues of rising house prices, issues of rapidly rising rent prices, and rent prices now are higher than they were before the crisis, and still going up quite quickly. At this time, 2013 is a kind of a largely stagnant market still outside of the cities. It's started to turn a bit now. There's rising homelessness, 9,000 people January, but we also have the persistence of some of these other issues, such as the unfinished estate, such as the negative equity, the mortgage arrears, and so on. Okay. So to me, not being adequately able to plan and manage that situation has been a problem, and not having an effective planning system prior to that has fed into some of these kinds of issues. That's not to say that a planning system and what local authorities were doing in and of themselves was bad, but in terms of coordination and the way in which they were competing interests working within it, have led to this issue of oversupply, issues of quality control through deregulation, and so on. So the government's approach in the boom was really one of kind of an adoption of kind of neoliberal ideas and practices. So it kind of prioritised market-led development, deregulation, promoted public-private partnerships, low corporate tax and so on. Both the construction industry and the banking sector saw a relaxation of regulatory oversight, whereas normally you'd want one of them to be the brake or the anchor on the other. You don't want both of them trammelling ahead. You want one to counteract the other, to want to be working to the public good as opposed to just simply for private profit. We started to see the withdrawal from social housing provision, and instead of relying on the private rental sector, and when it did provide social housing, it was through PPPs, and they significantly reduced the number of social housing units. So on a PPP-led development, say like Fatima Mansions, it went from 100% social housing to 20% social housing. So it's a significant remixing of what was going on with those developments. While the demand was high, the property sector was also afforded a very generous range of tax breaks. So the way that tax breaks work is when you have a depressed market or a depressed development sector, what you do is you create tax developments to basically kickstart the market. It's a bit like, in fact, I can say this with most of you know, you all remember what a choke on a car was. I talk to my students, right, and they have no idea what a choke on a car was. Okay. it's like you put the choke of the car on, you get the market working, and then you put it off again. The demand is there. There's no need to prime the demand. The demand's already there. We drove with the choke open for 20 years. We had tax development schemes running from 1986 up until the crisis. So, you know, we were literally driving with the choke open into. There was no need. There was demand. We had 1 million extra people, 600,000 extra households. That was driving. We didn't need to incentivize. We're going to have a laissez-faire, uncoordinated approach to housing and planning policy. And the planning system was effectively developer-led and was pro-growth in ethos. And there was really a presumption for development operating. And thus, planning itself was consistently undermined by localism, by clientism, by cronyism, by a lack of due regard to national spatial strategy, spatial planning in general, a lack of compulsion to comply with that. It's a due regard rather than compulsion. And also the policies of other government departments weren't aligned in with that. So there were basically too few checks and balances. And we can run the same thing across banking and finance and so on. Because we ended up with a whole series of crises. You know, we had a financial crisis, we had a fiscal crisis, we had an unemployment crisis, we had a housing crisis. These are all interlinked together. And of course the antidote was another round of neoliberalism. It was protecting the banking interests of the development sector through bank bailouts and the creation of NAMA. It was enforcing austerity measures to place significant stresses on households. There was a minimum response to most issues. There was very little, so no changes to housing and planning policy, other than to significantly cut the resourcing to responsive departments and to local authorities. Local authorities got very, very badly hit during the crisis in terms of their staffing. Things like housing, planning, architecture units all got decimated. Most local authorities have very few people under the age of 30 working in them, because there's basically been a freezing high for 10 years. And we had kind of a minimal policy, minimal effort, minimal cost approach to trying to fix the issue. So it's basically kind of try and give the impression that policy is work. A good example is the site resolution plans in relation to unfinished estates, and they effectively just pushed the things down the road. There was very little resources put into unfinished estates. The initial fund was 5 million across 2,900 estates. It's about 4 or 5 grand per estate. It's really not going to fix the issues on those estates. It basically tidies it up, puts fences around and makes it safe, and stop kids playing there. That's effectively what that kind of money does. And what we were really doing was waiting for market correction. And we're still waiting for market correction, which is one of the issues around housing supply. So, you know, we know there's a big need for housing supply, particularly in the cities, and yet there's very few houses coming through and onto the market or into social housing. So it's been a very slow process, and you know, it's basically a waiting for the market, or waiting for the banking and the property sector to right itself and then to start to deliver. There's very little capacity within the public sector to deliver that, given all the resourcing cuts. And then if you look at something like the Construction 2020 report and so on, that document gives a whole load of task forces, committees, review groups, consultations and so on, but there's very little policy or concrete actions. There's a lot of kind of good ideas in there, but it's very difficult to see how they can actually move through into concrete delivery of actions. And that's partly because there was very little budget linked up onto some of that stuff. That's partly what the National Planning Framework and the new National Development Plan is designed to fix. So it's going back to the NSS and kind of saying, okay, we know we've had all these problems in the NSS, and then we know we've had all these problems with the crisis. Can we produce a national planning framework that addresses those issues, that starts to get the coordination, starts to align up government departments so they're working with each other as opposed to against each other, and can we coordinate and plan how we're going to develop as a nation over the next 20 years on a basis that isn't sectoral, but it is on a basis that's kind of planned on a spatial basis. So this is where we were kind of out at the beginning of the national planning framework. Kind of local, regional, national development was being driven by 5 kind of initiatives. We had the 350 county, city, local development plans, regional planning guidelines, and so on. We had Construction 2020, we had a midterm economic strategy, we had an infrastructure and capital investment plan, and we had a framework for development regional enterprise strategies. And effectively, the first has become the new national planning framework. For the first and the last, the third and fourth have become the kind of the national development plan, and they're now being aligned and published simultaneously. So, the NDP in 2000, 2006, and the NSS were misaligned and missed the funding cycle. These two were published simultaneously this time, except one is a 22-year plan and one is a 10-year plan. So one runs from 2018 to 2027, and one runs from now until 2040. Okay, so when they were formulating the national planning framework, so the quote here is from a couple of years ago. So the objective of the national planning framework should be to establish a broad national plan for government in relation to strategic planning of urban and rural areas to secure balanced regional development, overall proper planning and sustainable development, and the coordination of regional spanning, spatial and economic strategies and city and county development plans, which kind of sounds like what the NSS was designed to do as well. Okay. And this is the kind of the plan in terms of, I know this will be too small to read, but so there's kind of these strategic outcomes, and it prioritises certain things. So it prioritises compact growth, regional accessibility, strengthened economies and communities, sustainable mobility, a strong economy, enterprise innovation and skills, high connectivity, basically broadband, enhanced immunity and heritage, transition to a lower carbon and climate resilient society, sustainable management of water waste and environment resources, and access to quality childcare, education and health services. Okay, so, and these effectively map on to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in the plan they're explicitly designed to do that. And then we have these kind of 10 strategic investment priorities, which is kind of housing and sustainable urban development, a national rural network, road network, rural development, environment sustainability, public transport, enterprise skills, innovation, capacity, airports and ports, culture, heritage and sport, climate action, water infrastructure, education, health and childcare. So hopefully there's a kind of a link up there between the investment priorities and the strategic outcomes. It's premised on that there'll be an extra 1 million people, so in the same way there was 1 million people between 1991 and 2011, there'll be roughly 1 million additional people by 2040. They said they're going to put it on a statutory footing under the Independent Office for the Planning Regulator, and it's going to be regional focused. So it's really up to the regions to create their own plans. This is a framework, but the actual planning of what will be delivered is done at the regional scale. So it's divided into 3 regions. These are the 3 regional assemblies: the Eastern Midland, the Northwest, Northern and Western, and Southern Regional Assembly. It's seeking 50% growth in this Eastern and Mid region, and 50% everywhere else. 75% of the growth will be outside of Dublin. So this is setting up population targets. Okay, and I'll show you that on the next slide. 50% of the growth will be in the 5 principal cities. So they're saying there'll be an extra 500,000 people between Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway and Waterford. And then the other 50% will be in large towns. And they single out Sligo and Letterkenny Derry, Athlone, and the kind of M1 corridor of Drogheda, Dundalk and Newry. At least 40% of all the housing will be delivered in existing built-up areas. So within the existing footprint of a town, 40% of the growth should happen inside that boundary by infilling and reusing brownfield sites. Okay, so not extending the sprawl, but kind of compacting and densifying what's going on. And they're going to set up a new National Regional Development Agency to try and coordinate that. And it says that job creation should be aligned with population growth. So they set targets about population growth, and they set targets about job growth. And then it's up to the regional assemblies to work out how are they going to deliver that based on this kind of framework. Okay. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the growth. So they're saying that Dublin will be an extra 500,000 people. So go up to, sorry. The Eastern Midland will be 490, basically 500,000 people, of which 230 to 290 will be in Dublin. Okay. Southern will grow by about 340 to 380,000, and Northern will 160 to 180. Cork will increase by around 100 to 125,000. Limerick by about 50 to 55,000, Waterford by 30 to 35,000, and so on. Now these are all substantial growths. These are all growths of kind of 40–50%. Okay, so they're seeing substantial growth in those regional cities. Galway grow by 40 to 45,000 people. So they're all basically these four. Dublin's increased by 20–25%. These are all increasing by 50 to 60%. But it also says that no place will be left behind. Okay, so these are quotes from the National Planning Framework. So it says a settlement that's not specifically identified for which specific targets are not set in this national framework are by no means precluded from future growth or investment, but that this must be considered at the local scale. So it's up to the regional assemblies to decide how much each individual town is targeted to increase by. Okay, so that's taking account of that NPF. So they clearly, in this region, will be sticking a lot of effort into Galway, Sligo and Letterkenny because they're all the designated regional growth poles, but then the rest of the growth will be across the local authorities within that area. It says within, in relation to rural fabric, it says reversing town, and these are the aims basically. Reversing town and village and rural population decline by encouraging new roles and functions for building streets and sites. Supporting sustainable growth of rural communities through development of rural areas. Implementing a properly planned local authority approach to identifying and meeting managing real housing needs arising from countryside areas, as partly around addressing overdevelopment and vacancy and so on. Improving local connectivity to principal communication, broadband, so obviously part of broadband national strategy, but also energy, transport and water, and promoting new economic opportunities arising from digital connectivity, indigenous innovation and enterprise, and so on. So that's what it's aiming for with the rural areas. And the mechanism is going to be these regional assemblies. So it's regional government and regional development are essential cogs for translating the policy. So they act as a mid-tier between the national framework and the local authorities and local county development plans. And the regional assemblies are tasked with coordinating, promoting, supporting strategic planning, sustainable development of the regions, and they're the ones to prepare these regional spatial and economic strategies. And that's already happening. It's already happening in this region. They've already had 4, I think, of the planning meetings, open town hall meetings and so on, around, well, there might have been stakeholder meetings actually, but they have 4 of them so far around preparing the regional economic strategy for the North and Western. And you can go onto the website and you can download the documents and read them yourself. For the 5 principal cities, they'll be developing their own metropolitan area strategic plans that should align with the regional spatial economic strategies, and they'll have a strategy underpinning and will act as a 12-year strategic plan and investment framework. So the regional really becomes this important level in terms of planning how towns are going to develop over the next 20 years and what kind of investment and so on will go into them. This is in one of the documents for the Northern and Western, and it gives an indication of where they initially see, based on the National Planning Framework, the growth. You'll be pleased to see that Westport is designated as one of the urban centres within this. And it basically sees a kind of 40% growth for a number of towns. So Cavan, Sligo, Letterkenny, Ballina, Castlebar, Galway increasing by 50–60%, and Athlone increasing by 20–25%. percent. So this is their initial. This isn't formalised. This is still to be negotiated out between the various stakeholders as to what the final targets will be. I don't know what Westport's target is. And so you can kind of see this is how the planning hierarchy has now been kind of rearranged. So we have the National Planning Framework at the top. We have this kind of regional, spatial, economic and metro strategic plans. We have kind of local economic community plans, county development plans, local area plans, and then individual projects. And this is all meant to work in sync now. This is all about coordinated planning with these, what's going on down here, aligning with this, and this aligning with this. Okay, so this is the idea, is that we have a kind of coordinated approach. The question is it going to work, given that the NSS was a spectacular failure? And I think there's a number of issues with that. Okay, so the first one is, if you read the document, you'll see loads of words that say things like enable, improve, encourage, enhance, ensure, cater for, target, support, but actually doesn't say how any of that's going to happen. It's all aspirational in that sense. So a lot of the policies make a lot of sense to me, and I would agree with quite a lot of them, in fact most of them, but I'm not sure how they envisage it actually happening. And what the document does is it pushes that down to this regional economic strategy and says it's up to each region to work out how that's actually going to happen. Okay, so you can see that in these are a couple of objectives around rural. So target the reversal of rural decline in small towns and villages through sustainable targeted measures that address vacant premises, deliver sustainable reuse and regeneration. Okay, fine, but how? Okay. As I've already said, the answer is that still has to be decided. Okay. But part of the issue is there is a governance deficit at the regional scale. Ireland has no tradition of regional level governance. We've had regional authorities since 94, 95. They typically have less than 10 staff. They have practically no budget. They have no powers or authority. They're a coordination kind of group that tries to encourage and coerce and coordinate the local authorities. But they have no teeth as a set of bodies as they exist at the minute. And all the power is still centralised into government departments and state agencies. And the local authorities have quite reduced functions in comparison to local authorities in other European countries, partly because, again, various services are actually delivered centrally or through state agencies as opposed to through the local authorities. And they have very little influence over government departments and agencies working within their territories. And so what the National Planning Framework has to do is align lots of other policies, so policies that are in transport, in health, in education, and so on, in communications, energy, etc. And it will also need new policies will need to align with the NPF. So that's going to need a lot of coordination. And the question would be: is Enterprise Ireland and IDA going to align their policy with the NPF, or are they just going to carry on their current policy, which is to work with companies to allow companies to go where they want to go? They don't really care where they go as long as they come into the country and create jobs. They're not saying you can only come into the country, but you have to be located there. Okay? The NPF kind of says you have to be located there because that's where we want our growth. Okay? So if every company wants to come in and they want to go into Dublin, are we going to start saying no? And they'll say, okay, fine, we'll go to Lotz in Poland, or we'll go to Lille in France, or we'll go to. Or are we going to say, okay, fine, you can locate in Dublin? But the NPF actually wants us to kind of push for that to be a realignment around that kind of economic strategy. And we don't know whether the state agencies will actually align with that or not. And if we look at a review conducted by the OECD in 2008, they identified the biggest risk to government in Ireland is the lack of cooperation and coordination across departments and agencies in terms of the state's performance. we have departments and agencies that effectively act as silos, okay, with not great interaction. So there's a very strong silo mentality, and departments defend their functional autonomy vis-a-vis others. And that's going to need a cultural and institutional change. So we're expecting the National Planning Framework to act without any kind of institutional change around governance. And there's been very little change around, for example, how local government is organised in Ireland for a really long time. We've had the 4 new authorities in Dublin. We've recently had city and county mergers in Limerick, Waterford, and Tipperary. But other than that, we've had very little. And what it means is we have a very a legacy of development with no reform, in that sense, of governance reform. So we have, the smallest local authority is Leitrim with about 30,000 people. The largest is DC with about 500,000 people. And yet the same services are expected to be delivered through both. So the scales of economy, organisation, and so on don't really match up. Okay, so you would expect with this kind of planning framework that you would actually have some level of institutional local governance reform. And as Prentice Brannock has kind of argued, like local and regional tiers of government must have effective control of public services delivered within their territories, and must possess sufficient publicly perceived status to allow them to perform the leadership and regulatory roles envisaged by the OECD, and that requires devolution. So that means devolution of powers to regional and local levels. It's also not clear how the investment is tied together, and who has control of the decision making, and what are the means. So if Air Grid and National Roads Authority and so on want to do one thing, and the regional spatial strategies want to do another, how is that resolved? And who coordinates that, and how does the money flow around that, and so on? Will property developers and companies honour it, or will they just seek to locate where they wish? Will politicians honour it? What happens if the government changes? Is it really a 22-year plan? And so on. In theory, it should be, but as you see from my history of the NSFs, there's been a whole series of cycling through different policies and so on. And there's also whether the targets we met, so Cork, Limerick, Galway, Waterford, will have to grow at twice the rate that they actually achieved in the last 25-year period if they're to meet those growth targets, which is really very rapid development. Now it can be done if you look at somewhere like China, where you have really incredible rates of growth. You can do it, but then they have very strong government and master planning, and it's sort of just pushed through basically. So conclusion. So planning and development has progressed along a rocky road over the last 55 years. It's generally been laissez-faire and pro-development. There's been this ongoing tension between finance and environment, and also between the spatial and the sectoral. There's been active resistance to strong regulatory planning, and there's been a governance deficit for institution-led planning, both at local authority level. I think they've been starved of resources and so on, but also at the regional level where there's very little capacity. There's been a very poor record of spatial planning, which has been consistently undermined. Planning, I think we can argue, has contributed to bust boom and bust cycles. I think the National Planning Framework is a step in the right direction, but there's a number of concerns related to implementation and governance that I think need to be looked at if it's to actually succeed. And the danger is it just becomes another plan that fails to be implemented. And I'll end there.